Welcome to Roots and Futures. I am Dr. Jasmine Harris, Department Chair of Africana Studies at Metropolitan State University. This is a platform for amplifying local and global Black experiences. We're going to be talking about Black communities. We're going to be talking to Black people and trying to understand the connections and disconnections across the diaspora. So join us. Welcome to Roots and Futures. I am Dr. Jasmine Harris, as always, and today we are going to talk about the importance of knowing our history. And every episode, we start with a quote to sort of help us organize our thoughts around the topic of the day. And today's quote is going to come from Malcolm X. Malcolm X said, "Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today." And I thought that that was a really important quote to bring forward in the midst of all of the chaos that we're seeing in the United States right now. I come to you all as a Minnesotan, as someone who was born and raised in Minneapolis. I went to high school there. I completed my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and most of my friends and family still live in that state. As you probably already know, 2 Minnesotans, American citizens, were murdered by ICE agents in Minneapolis, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. What I want to talk about today in relationship to Malcolm X's quote is how important this moment is for us as American citizens to recognize that we are reliving past experiences that we have already seen. But because America is a country that's founded on racism, on division across made-up racial lines that were created 400 years ago for the gain of a small population of white men, it's hard to see. In particular, on Twitter, which is where I hang out. I'm old, y'all, so I still call it Twitter, and also don't know how to use TikTok or any of those other things. So my social media understanding mostly comes from Twitter, and I have mostly curated a timeline that shows me the things that I'm interested in. But last week, a tweet got through from a white woman that said something to the effect of, not quoting her directly, but "Can we go back to regular police brutality, please?" As a request, as a statement, right? And I thought that this was such an interesting tweet from what seems to be a young white woman, although you can never tell who's cosplaying who on social media, because it suggests that, one, they understand that what we're seeing right now is not quote unquote regular police brutality, but two, that they also understand that what regular police brutality is the violent and traumatic arrest and incarceration of Black and brown people in the United States. And what has immobilized this country, what has mobilized Minneapolis and Minnesota as a state, has been the fact that the 2 people who were murdered by federal agents in that city were white. And now it feels like this is different than the kind of police state that we were living under before, which was specifically just about policing Black and brown people. So when you think about crack and cocaine, for example, white people are much more likely, and all the data shows us this, they are much more likely to abuse drugs. But they're much less likely to be arrested for using drugs. They're also much more likely to have a smaller sentence if they are, found to be in possession of illegal substances. That's not because of some biological difference between white people and black people, but it is a reflection of the ways that judges perceive people differently by race, the differences in the way that we police certain drugs. We police cocaine much differently than we police crack, which is crazy because they have exactly the same ingredients. And it's just about the way that they are produced that is different. One more cheaply, one more expensively. As you probably guessed and understand, Black people are much more likely to be abusers and users of crack historically in the United States because it's a cheaper version of the substance. I say all of this to say that we have to do a better job of paying attention to history as it's happening, even when it's happening to communities that we don't belong to. Black people who were at the front lines of protests in Ferguson after the murder of Mike Brown in the street by a local police officer, Black people who protested and marched after the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman in Florida. These are things that happened over a decade ago where communities of Black people were screaming for help, for visibility around the way that they were being policed in their own communities, and there was much silence. Now, some people might say, well, in 2020, George Floyd was also murdered in Minneapolis. And just as an aside, as someone who grew up in a state that most people don't think about, it is wild to me that in the last 6 years, 3 of the most inciting incidents of law enforcement murdering its own people, and that becoming a galvanizing force for citizens across the country to protest this treatment happening in Minneapolis, of all places, seems inconceivable. And if you had said to me at 12 or 13 or 14 that that this is where Minneapolis would end up in our pursuit for national justice, I would say, that I wouldn't believe you, right? And you would be right to point out that George Floyd was also a galvanizing event, and that people, white people in particular, started to pay attention to the importance of police brutality. But that was 6 years ago. And almost nothing has changed in terms of the way that we police Black and brown people, especially around the country. And so you can't necessarily treat that as a turning point in the same way that we see Alex Preddy's murder and Renee Good's murder being treated. For sure. Did you have a question about any of the things I just said?
So when I'm hearing about all these subjects, it always comes back to the question of like today's current topics, specifically about race. And a question that always comes back to me is how does this relate to young Black Americans? What should we digest from all of this? Because hearing stuff like this is very contradictory because we grow up thinking, at least from my experience, we grow up thinking being Black means you're a minority. It's a sympathy card. It's always like you're always going to be antagonized by law enforcement and so on. And what we gain from this is like people go into two splitting mindsets of why we believe or see ourselves as victims. We see ourselves as victims that we have to fight in this victim mentality against the big man, or it switches to the other kind of mentality where I say it's more like a conservative route of where we need to stop thinking of ourselves as victims and we need to stop trying to make the white people and like other kind of conservative parties the bad guys and everything. What
Yeah.
do you say to stuff like that?
Yeah, you know what? Thank you so much for that question. It reminds me, I gave a Black History Month talk actually in 2023 at Austin Community College in Texas. And a student, after I gave my talk, we had a Q&A, and a student stood up and um, he asked about affirmative action. And he basically was saying, why do we still need affirmative action to help Black people get into particular colleges and universities, get particular jobs? Doesn't that play into this victim mindset that he was sort of trying to position it as, like, white people basically created this trap, right? And now we can't get out of this victimhood. And at the time he was asking the question, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little annoyed because I was like, "Wait, what are you talking about? Of course we need affirmative action. Of course it's not a victim mentality." But what I have come to realize in the intervening years is that there is a big knowledge gap from my generation as a millennial. I'm 42, right? So, I'm an elder millennial, and Gen Zers and Gen Alpha-ers, whatever you call that. In that when we were growing up, because Black history wasn't well laid out for us at school, and because we weren't that far removed from Jim Crow and slavery even, right? We were given a lot of that education at home. My my father's grandparents are from Canton, Mississippi, which is a little small town outside of Birmingham, and they migrated with some of their children, and they went on to have more, to Chicago in the early 50s, 1951, I wanna say, because they were escaping Jim Crow. They were still living in a place where there were whites only and blacks only, water fountains and bathrooms and restaurants and hotels, right? And so we weren't just sort of educated about those things, but we were told personal stories. My great-grandmother, who passed away when I was 10, 11, her mother was an enslaved person, right? Like we were not as far removed. And so we had a different sort of feeling about things like affirmative action, things like racism being at the sort of foundation of a lot of the disparities that we see, not just in income and housing, but in health, right? One of the reasons why heart disease is such a big killer of Black men, in particular in the United States, is not biological, it's sociological, right? It is a distrust of the medical system that dates back to the syphilis, experiments that were done on Black people in the South. It is an inequitable access to health insurance that allows for preventative testing for these sorts of things. It's a disproportionate incomes that allowed you to be able to afford the treatments for things like heart disease or cancers, right? And so we sort of got those things constantly, where we could see and understand the need for guardrails around race and racism to support our ability to live equitable lives, right? But y'all are not getting that, and it's not your fault, right? In the same way that students today are not great typers and are not great handwriters, that's just because you didn't have to learn handwriting and cursive writing so diligently in school, right? Because the curriculum has changed. When I was in high school and middle school, we had to take computer class where literally they would give us something, if it was Black History Month, they give us like the I have a dream speech, and they make us type it up. Class is an hour, you have an hour to type this up. And if you're a fast typer, then you can finish and then you can talk to your friends. If you're a slow typer, you're going to have to do this for the whole hour and, figure it out. And now I can type without even looking at the keyboard. Sometimes students will come in and I'm writing some email, and they're like, "Oh, you're not even looking at the keys." It's like, no, I'm not, because I went through that education. And I think where we failed the younger generations in this country is that y'all were born in the middle of a tech boom. And everybody around us, and that includes people in the Black community, said they have at their fingertips access to all the information that we never had access to. So we shouldn't even have to explain to them why we need these things, because they can find that information. But what we didn't do is show you guys how to find it, right? We said, here's your phone, here's your tablet, there's YouTube, there's Google, right? Have at it. But because we never gave you the skills to find that information and yet plopped you down in the middle of the internet as it was exploding and starting to be used for nefarious reasons, right, by bad actors, you became more susceptible to white supremacist messaging about victimhood, right? When I hear young Black people say, "Well, I don't want to be seen as a victim. I feel like my grandmother when she's like, don't use the slave master's English." It very much feels like that, where it's like, who told you that understanding that the history of the United States in particular is not just founded on race, but on racism, right? On division. We start bringing enslaved people over on ships in 1619, but we don't create racial boundaries until the early 1700s. And the only reason that we start creating those racial boundaries is white people in power start to realize that there is an opportunity to create a hierarchy here that puts them at the top and that stagnates Black people at the bottom without them really ever having to do anything, right? And so, like, one of the things that my students will tell you about my classes is that I will always come back to this idea of race and racism as the foundation for almost any experience, social structure, social institution in the United States. That's not victimhood. It's just fact, right? But white people, in particular, white people who are not interested in the feelings of guilt and shame that come from not even participating, right? We're saying we know you didn't participate in slavery,
Mhm.
but your grandmother, your great grandmother may have, and not necessarily as a plantation owner, right? Because plantation owners were the one percenters. They're the Bill Gates, the Elon Musks of the time. But they enlisted everyone else to do their bidding, right? So when we see these ICE agents out here, many immigrants themselves, many with Latinx last names. And so they're using those people, not the one percenters, the everyday people, to continue to do the work of white supremacy, in this case, to deport all the illegals, quote unquote, right? And make America great again, which essentially means make it a place where Black and brown people know that their place is at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? And regardless of class, education, I am someone that white supremacists hate to see coming, right? To use your language, because I have a PhD, right? Because I have achieved all of these things. I've written a book, I've done all of these things that a lot of white people have not done. And they are being socialized. They have continued to be socialized this way for hundreds of years to see a Black person in a place socially or financially ahead of them, to mean that they must in some way be getting some kind of undue benefit from the government or from somebody to allow for that possibility, right? And that thinking then makes them think that policies like affirmative action are not necessary, that the Voting Rights Act, right, is not necessary, something that my ancestors fought for. I vote in every election. I vote in local elections, I vote in midterm elections, I vote in presidential year elections because my grandmother would kill me. She would come back from the grave to kill me if she knew that I was opting out of a right that my people fought for, and one that we did not have for a long time because they were worried, right, that any amount of ability to contribute to the democratic process would make us seem a little bit more human.
Mhm.
And they don't want us to be human, right? And so this idea of victim mentality, even as a thing, it reminds me of misandry. Remember the other day when somebody said misandry, and I was like, that is not a thing, right? It's
Oh.
like reverse racism is not a thing. Victim mentality when it comes to racism, especially when you're talking about the white black dichotomy, which is the foundation of racism in the United States, it can exist, right? Because race and racism is still at the foundation of everything that we do, right? And this attempt to I wanna use the word inculcate, but that sounds so pretentious. But to sort of embed this idea of Black people having a victim mindset and then encouraging young Black people to get out of that mindset is so that they can erase all of the gains institutionally and structurally that we have fought for and made in this country to allow people like me to have a PhD. You know what I mean? Like, before the 1970s, almost no Black people had PhDs. Even now, less than 2% of all faculty in the United States are Black. And that's not because we are not as smart. That's not because we're not as capable. That's because the likelihood that we will have the educational tract that would prepare us for and allow us entrance into doctoral programs is so minimal, and there's so much luck involved. I tell people this all the time, that it's truly unlikely for most of us to get there, and that's the way the system was set up, right? I'm mostly passionate about this when I'm talking about higher education admittance and affirmative action and admissions policies, right? Because the way that white people and Asian people on this topic have sort of taken it over as, well, they're just letting Black people in that are not as smart, don't have as high as scores on their SATs, don't have as good of grades, and that's not it at all. It's that these policies were instituted in the 90s because before that, the top schools in the country were completely white, and after, they're still completely white. There's just, like, 20 more Black students there than would have been there 50 years ago, right? And they're using those small incremental changes to say things like, well, we're post-racial, right? You're too young to remember when Obama was elected and the way that went, but white people use that as an opportunity to say, we are in this post-racial moment, race doesn't matter anymore. We've got a Black man as the president, right? Um, and we see what happened after we had a Black man as the president for 8 years, right? White people lost their minds because they could not believe that not only was a Black man put in this position after they put all these guardrails up to keep them from being able to be in this position, but then they had to suffer the indignity of being governed by that Black man against their will for 8 years, right? And so I guess this is such a long-winded answer to your question, right? But what I'm saying is that victim mentality is a phrase that was created by white supremacists to encourage Black people to turn away from policies and practices that our family members, our community members, and our ancestors worked so hard to get so that we could make some gains, right? So I graduated from Vassar College. Um, it's called a Seven Sisters School because back when all the Ivy Leagues were created, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, um, white women could not go to those schools, right? Those schools were created for rich, white, Protestant landowning men. I talk about this in my book. Um, and the first Black woman to graduate from Vassar was Anita Hemmings in 1897, but she was passing as a white woman. And when her roommate, Lulu Taylor, found out that she was passing as a white woman, she told the president, and they allowed her to graduate with the assumption that it wouldn't get out. She was very upset about that, and her family leaked it to the press after graduation, so it became this sort of news story. 30 years later, this is my second book is about, she sends her daughter, Anita Hemmings sends her daughter to Vassar as well in 1923, also passing as a white woman. And Lulu, Anita's old roommate, gets wind of this, writes a letter to President McCracken, the person who's the president at the time, and she literally says in the letter, "I'm trying to stop another student from having to suffer the indignity that I had to suffer in rooming with a Negro," right, in the letter. It wouldn't be until they started in 38 and graduated in 41 because of the war, that three Black women, Beatrix McCleary, I'm going to forget the other two, June Christmas, and Camille Cottrell. Those are the three very light-skinned Black women. And W.E.B. Du Bois had to call the president of the college himself in 1938 and say, "Please let these women attend this school. They are light enough that they will be unlikely to offend any of the other white women at the school." And that is the only reason that those women were allowed to go. These stories, not available when I was at Vassar, when I was one of 40 Black students at the school at the time, right? And that's on purpose because Vassar's not a place for Black women, right? It wasn't created for Black women. It's only been 50, 60 years that Black women have been readily welcomed into the institution. And so when I was there and I was experiencing all of this racism, I was thinking to myself, like you were just saying, what's wrong with me? Right? I must not be prepared for this. I must not belong in this space. I was buying into that victim mentality, right? That like, oh, I can't complain too much because I'm here, right? And I don't want them to think that I don't fit in here or I don't believe that I'm good enough. But all of that is manifested by a white supremacist culture that has no place for Black people, right? And the more that we buy into that and perpetuate it and say it out loud to other people, the more likely it is to work. And so what we have to do, all of us, is every time we hear those things, we have to stamp it down right then. And so that's why I started this conversation talking about that talk that I gave at Austin Community College, because I was so taken aback and a little angry about, what he'd said, that I was sharp, in my response. And he came over after and said, thank you, right? That like no one had explained it to him like that before. And that he realized that the premise of his question was wrong because he was coming at it from the wrong place. And that's exactly what they want. I love that question because, and that's why I wanted to start with Malcolm X, right? This quote about education being the passport to the future. Because the other thing that's happening right now that's also really pissing me off
Higher education.
right? this current administration is doing everything that they can to roll back all of the gains that Black people have made in higher education. And they're going so far as dismantling all of the Department of Education to do so. And a lot of people, again, are talking about this like, oh, this is some new thing. Trump is this deranged person. Absolutely not. Ronald Reagan tried to destroy the Department of Education in his first presidential term,
Yeah.
right? Ronald Reagan is the reason that University of California schools cost money for California citizens. Before he became the governor of California, the University of California higher education system was completely free for citizens of the state. So you could go to UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, UC Davis, all of these schools, right? UC San Francisco for free if you lived in California. But, Ronald Reagan comes into his governorship around the same time as protests around Vietnam War start. And much like we're seeing, around the Palestinian genocide, what we're seeing right now around ICE protests, protest started in schools, right? In high schools, in colleges, on college campuses. And famously, Reagan, or infamously maybe, because a lot of people don't know this, but Reagan was caught on a hot mic basically saying, I hate those dirty hippie students, right? And like, we have to tighten up our state school system so that those kids are not present and disrupting the educational system in California. And so one of his first things was to create tuition for that school, right? And then he gets to the president position, tries to dismantle Department of Education. We had perhaps a little bit more balanced Congress back then, right? Both in terms of morals and in terms of numbers. And so they did not allow him to completely dismantle it. They did allow him to defund it 25%, right? Which also drove up tuitions across the country, right? Because most schools, public state-funded schools, right, rely on some amount of federal funding for those things, right? And so that's where you get tuition. My mother graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1979. She paid her tuition and room and board and food and books and everything by waitressing at a local bar. Not even every day. 3 or 4 days a week, because the year tuition was like $1,500. Vassar, the school that I went to, when I went there, it was $47,000 a year. And the only reason that I could afford to attend is because I got awarded a merit scholarship because of my grades in high school. And that covered 50% of my tuition. I was a work study student. I took out some student loans, and then my parents paid the last small portion. Do you know how much Vassar was this year?
I want to say like 60,000.
$89,000 a year, right? That's what I mean when I say they're talking about victimhood while simultaneously increasing the guardrails to access to these places,
to make
right?
it more impossible.
Yep, absolutely. Taking away the affirmative action policies and admissions. We've already seen for 2 years of this that the number of Black and brown students at especially the prestigious, expensive universities has gone down since they removed those affirmative action policies from their process. Yeah. And so, you have these folks out here, even Donald Trump, right? He says, smart people don't like me. Robert F. Kennedy said, don't listen to the experts, right? They are actively trying to get regular people, Black and brown, but poor white people as well, as far away from higher education as possible. They're not preventing their children. They're not telling their children not to go to college or not to go to graduate school. They're telling our children not to go to college and not to go to graduate school, right? So that they can continue to create that distance between us and them.
I can say growing up, I would have never found out about historical Black figures like Catherine Goebel,
Mm.
Rosa Parks.
Mm-hmm. Or even
Like,
like with Rosa Parks, right? Like when I was growing up, it was, she's just a little old lady and she got on the bus and she was so tired and that's why she sat in the front and they didn't want to her to sit in the front, but she was just this little old lady, right?
yeah,
But
but you just
in reality, Rosa Parks was an active member of SNCC. She was an active part of creating the Montgomery bus protest. What happened that day was planned meticulously before it happened. She wasn't an old lady. Rosa Parks is also a yogi, right? Learning about her yoga tradition is what got me into yoga. I've been doing it for 20 years. And so she was agile and healthy and strong, right? She could have walked to the back of the bus if she wanted to, but that wasn't the plan. But not educating us to think about the civil rights movement in particular as this well-organized network of schools and churches and communities of people across the country, right? They don't want you to know that because that level of sophistication then encourages people to do the same. One of the things that has been interesting about watching all of the critique and public discourse about what's happening in Minneapolis is folks being surprised at the level of coordination and sophistication, the community collaboration and support, the observers, right, doing what is their, First Amendment right to observe the legal proceedings of the federal government. And people who are from this area are like, well, we just had George Floyd like 6 years ago, and that experience helped us get organized. So we were already prepared when this started to pop off in the city because we have been organizing and working together as a community for years. But they don't want to publicize that, right? So instead, they're like, oh, these are paid
it's
agitators.
just cherry
Democrats are
picking.
paying people to come into the city to do these things. And it's like, no, you don't have to pay us to do these things. It might look like we're being paid because we're so organized, but we're so organized because we have learned from each other. After George Floyd and before this, there were a lot of conversations with Palestinian protesters, and protesters from around the world about what things work best for you, right? In Minnesota, the Kimmis have gotten involved, and this is something that came from conversations with Palestinian protests, where those tear gas bombs that they throw into the crowds, if you put a plastic like traffic cone over it and then you pour this like chemical solution that chemistry teachers have access to into it, it will disarm it, right? And so you're seeing folks doing that on the ground in Minneapolis, and then conservatives are like, where are they learning to do this? These people are paid, the Democrats are paying them. And it's like, no, it's just smart people talking to other smart people and organizing, right? But there is a vested interest in keeping that information at bay, right? Because it then makes folks feel like, oh, these are just angry Black people or sad Black people, right?
Yeah.
And that's why they're doing these things, as opposed to, no, we have goals, we have objectives, we have strategy, and we have execution because we have brains just like white people do,
And at the
right?
end of the day, we're all human beings. It's to the point like I remember even when I was following a lot of conservative parties over the summer of 2025, and I was finding out about how lots of conservative parties were even talking about George Floyd, saying like George Floyd was a
Mm-hmm.
drug dealer who restrained police arrests, and like,
Mm-hmm.
oh,
Well, and that's, what I was saying earlier about the tweet that said, can we go back to regular police brutality, right? That's what they mean. They mean not shooting white people in the back when they're on their knees, not shooting white women in the face when they're in their cars, but kneeling on the neck of a supposed drug addict because he passed a counterfeit 20 at a local grocery store. Like
Mhm.
that doesn't sound like an escalation to you. And it doesn't if you allow their sort of logic and rhetoric to um, color the way that you understand these things, especially when they're not. The hypocrisy is so clear, right? So you were talking earlier about how folks are discouraging people from going to college, calling it a scam, which again is sort of like a generational thing, right? Because when I was in high school, if you didn't go to college, you were sort of seen as the loser. "Oh, he didn't go to college. Don't say anything to him." Like, "Oh, are we inviting him to the graduation party? He's not going anywhere." Because when I was in, because I'm old, when I was in high school, at the college graduation parties, you wore the sweatshirt of the school that you had gotten accepted to. And it was like, "Hey, this is where I'm going," right? Sort of thing. And so if you weren't going, then, and we fought really hard, I think, in the last 20 years against that, right? With this understanding that college isn't for everybody, although I'm of the mindset that it is for most people. That's just me, right? But then you've got people who benefited from that system actively telling you not to benefit from it, right? Erica Kirk, speaking of Charlie Kirk, right, is out here, seemingly celebrating her husband's death because there's always fireworks and dancers and stuff. It seems weird to me, right? But she's doing these interviews and she's like, "Oh, we need to get back to good conservative values and having children, and it's not really necessary to go to college or have a career." And this is a woman who went to college, had a career before she got married and had children, right? But she's actively out there telling women who are younger than her not to follow in her footsteps because, frankly, a large populace of highly educated women is one of the reasons why we have low fertility rates in the United States right now, right? We are at the bottom of the bell curve right now in terms of live births across the globe, right? It's easy to tell a bunch of 20-something women that, like, "Oh, you don't want to try to work your way up the corporate ladder. It's crazy over here. You're going to be much happier if you find a husband and you are a stay-at-home mom and you just make meals and do laundry and take care of your kids." But women only did that for hundreds of years, and they actively did everything they could to get out of that scenario, right?
Mhm.
And it's only the fact that these, 20-something women or men that are, being fed this stuff don't have that history. Like my mother always tells the story of when she went and opened her own bank account. She was 16.
Mhm.
It was 1974. You know what I mean? Like my mother, who is still alive, who's not even 70 years old yet, is old enough to remember when women could not have their own checking accounts. They couldn't have their own credit cards. They couldn't sign mortgages on homes, right? And all of this rhetoric is hoping and maybe knowing in some ways that history is actively being lost
It's
because that risk is not biological, right? Like when you use a data point like that, right? That black women are much more likely to die in and after childbirth than white women, for example. That's not about physical differences or biological differences or genetic differences. It's literally about the way the doctors and the nurses care for Black women, right? The way that they think about our tolerance for pain, the way that they believe or don't believe, the way that we are describing our symptoms. "Oh, you're just exaggerating, right?
Mhm.
It's just a little contraction. You're fine. It's just a little bleeding. You're fine." And then the next day that person is dead. for Beyonce and Serena Williams, two of the most popular Black women that we have in the world, came out and said, "We almost died in childbirth because of neglect on the part of our doctors and nurses." And you have to assume that these very rich women, right, have the best, quote unquote, doctors and nurses in the world serving them. And they're Beyonce and Serena Williams. And they're telling their doctors about their symptoms and they're still being ignored. Serena says often, if I wasn't married to a white man and he hadn't started raising hell in the hospital room when there was clearly something wrong with me after I'd given birth, I'd be dead right now because I was bleeding internally and nobody believed me, right? And that's how many women die. A Black woman just died in childbirth last month who was a doula and a midwife. Someone who worked in this field, someone who delivered babies every day, and she died a few days after her child was born because she was dealing with internal hemorrhaging, and the doctors that were caring for her didn't catch it.
And what's really frustrating gets to the point like where everyone always says Black people are so quick to play the victim card, so quick to shut down a white person by just saying the word racist and everything. But to the point like you're maybe not even doing it intentionally, but do you even realize the long-term effects? Because I believe I told you this like our last meeting that I was almost arrested because of a white woman, and that's not even a shout out shade to any white person at all and everything. But I remember I was walking home from school. I remember it was early in the morning. I didn't have any classes that day because I was leaving school early for a camping trip. And I had seemed to lost my glasses. I misplaced my glasses, left them in the car and everything. I didn't have my phone on me at the time because I also forgot that. And I had to walk home, walk 20 minutes in the cold. It was like 43 degrees. Like, that's probably not important, but I just hate the cold. So I have to just say that.
It was very,
I
very
hate the
cold.
cold. And I remember I reached my garage. I had reached my garage and everything. And my garage has like one of those garage openers, put the pin in. But I don't know if everyone's is like this, but like when it's cold out, it doesn't work.
Sticks sometimes.
Yeah. And I remember it took me a good while to, not, I won't even say a while, I'd say like somewhere between like 10, possibly 15 minutes to try to get into my house. And it wasn't even doing anything suspicious. It was broad daylight. It was like 10 in the morning. It was like 10 in the morning. Sun was still bright out. I had my school bag on me and everything. And it was just me trying to open a garage. It was just me trying to put in a code. It was trying me to like manually lift it, not anything aggressive. And then I remember this woman, she's my neighbor, never met her day in my life. And I lived at that for like a good part of my childhood. I lived in that neighborhood for a good part of my childhood. And it was this woman who even looked like she was in the process of moving out, literally said, "Excuse me, do you live there?" And I'm all like, "Yeah, yes, I do live here." And then she's like, "No, you don't. I'm calling the police." And I said, "But I live here. I live here." And she's all like, "I'm calling the police. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the police." And then it just became like a frustration to like keep going. And then like as timing would have it, literally a few minutes after she had just was on the phone reporting me to the police, I was able to open my garage. And then I remember she said to the phone, "Oh, surprisingly, he was able to get in." And I remember I went in, went downstairs to my mom. My mom and my dad were sleeping, so they weren't able to like open for me. And I had to explain the situation. My mom was all like, were you trying to sneak through a window or something? I'm like, no, I was literally just trying to open the garage.
Yeah.
I was literally trying to open the garage. I wasn't even doing anything suspicious. And then I had to come out and I was like 16, like 16-year-olds and like their hormones and their anger. I was very angry and I was trying to like restrain myself as best as I could. And I was saying like, you accused me of breaking into my own house.
What makes me so mad about these kinds of stories too is that white people have, and this again takes us back to the tweet about like wanting to do police brutality regularly, right? That white people for so long have been able to be the sort of arbiters of who belongs where, right? And in some cases, that is a death sentence, right? And there's no the way that we know that racism is at the bottom of these things, right? And not just, well, it was taking you a long time, you could have been a burglar, is because it doesn't your class status, none of that matters. Do you know who Henry Louis Gates
They
is?
actually do.
So he's a professor at Harvard, right? And he lives in Cambridge, which is where Harvard is, like very rich neighborhood outside of Boston. And this was back when Obama was president. So maybe like 2010, 2011, he locked his keys in the house and he's trying to get back to get into his house. There's like an open window on the side of the house, and he is trying to, get it open enough so that he can climb in and get into his home. And one of his neighbors, and this man has lived in this neighborhood for a while. He's a famous professor, right, at Harvard, which is right down the street, which I'm sure everybody knew. One of his neighbors called the police, and the police came and they ended up arresting him because he was so angry, right? And so we have to simultaneously ignore race and racism, right? And be calm in the face of it, while also constantly being gaslit about the fact that it exists at all. You're not doing it on purpose, right? Okay. But you are socialized to think that way. I'm a sociologist, right? And so everything that I think about in terms of the world is like, how did we get here, right?
Yes.
What what group behavior is driving this? And so when I say that someone is socialized to do something, what I mean is that they have been in every walk of life, from the way that their parents talk to the way that their teachers talk to the things that they see on TV and in movies and commercials. They are taught to think a particular way about Black people, right? And they don't see that as racism because it is the way that they are socialized. But if that's the case, then a race card, quote unquote, doesn't exist, right? Racism is a fundamental part of the fabric of American life,
Built into the DNA.
right? It is the way that we interact with each other. It is the way that we perceive people when they walk into a room. It is the movies that we watch and the television shows that we binge at home. And it's really easy for white people to feel offended by the term racist, right? Because they feel like it is a direct war on their morality in some ways, or maybe war is not the right word, but a sort of a direct identifier of how we perceive their morality. Instead of recognizing that you are behaving in a system the way that the system wants you to behave. And until everybody can see that, then we are always going to have racism. It's like there's this new great show you should all watch. It's called Paradise, starring Sterling K. Brown, who I love if you're listening. And what I love about the sort of analogy of the show, right, is that there's been this nuclear war. We're not exactly sure exactly what happened, but something happened on the surface, probably nuclear war. And so the small group of people get to live in this fake dome underground, right, in the Colorado mountains, ironically. It's not until there start to be cracks, right, where you can see, oh, that's not a sunny day. It's a roof, right, that people on the ground start to realize, oh, this isn't paradise, actually. Maybe this is like prison. And that's how I feel about racism in the United States, right? It's there, but because of the way it has been socialized into people for hundreds of years, most people, especially most white people, walk around like they're living in this idyllic paradise. And it's not until like what happened in Minnesota, and, white people start being murdered by law enforcement, that you start to see that what you thought was an endless blue sky is actually a roof, right? And that racism is actually imprisoning all of us because it is impacting our ability to become community with one another, right? To support one another, to engage with one another, to fight the system at large more broadly. And I wish that more people would think about race, white people, I should say, should think about race and racism as like shackles around their own arms and ankles that's keeping them from being able to understand the world. That's why there was this whole takeover of the word woke, right? When Black people use the word woke, what they mean is that you start to recognize all of the ways that you are being imprisoned and trapped by the institutions and structures of a particular society, right? It's not about canceling people or blah, 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 right? It's about being able to see the world for what it is. And conservatives in particular do not want people to be able to see the world the way that it is, because if they do, then they will see that we are all being taken advantage of for the benefit of a handful of people who have more money than they could spend in 5 lifetimes. They have enough money to end homelessness. They have enough money to fund universal basic education. They have enough money to fund free kindergarten and preschool for all students. They have enough money to pay for vaccines for folks, but they're never going to do that because all they care about is the benefit of those handful of people, and it is the rest of us, all of us, regardless of race, regardless of religion, who are being imprisoned by their desires. Right? And so I think this is maybe where we should wrap up for the episode. But I really like this conversation, and I want to just take us back to the quote that we started with Malcolm X about education being the passport to the future, right? Because tomorrow belongs to those people who prepare for it today, and you can't know how to prepare for today if you don't know what happened yesterday. Right. And if you don't know that the past is there, then you can't readily prepare for the future. And that's what they're hoping. That's why they're pushing people away from education. That's why they're stripping cities. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but in Philadelphia, they've taken all of the Black history plaques off of the buildings around the city, right? That's not about wokeness or anti-wokeness. That's about removing the history so that the young people who are coming up have no frame of reference to understand what's happening to them now. And that is in the best interest of the people in power. All right. This has been Roots and Futures. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon.
This podcast is powered by The Plug.